Hi! Okay, so, a little short stream, Let's Talk stream today. This was not the original plan, we're going a little bit out of order, but I have a little topic I wanted to talk about today, just cuz. Um, Today I actually wanted to converse, it's only going to be like for 30 minutes, or a little more or less, I'm not sure yet. I'm kind of drained from the day, and I don't want to. This is going to be one of those live ones. A couple days we'll be doing another live stream where it's actually going to be the Let's Make a Game stream. So we'll be doing that in a couple days. Originally today was supposed to be the Final Fantasy binge, but I am way too drained and exhausted for that. So we're just going to be doing a discussion today. And today I actually kind of wanted to, this is more or less opinionated, serious kind of thing, but today I wanted to talk about my thoughts on each generation and how different and not adaptive, but how through each generation, things and beliefs, adaptation, persistence, patience, any factor you can list, it has a tendency to somehow shift. Hey Taylor, fun fact, what I'm talking about today is actually something that you inspired me to talk about. Now, I'm going to be very cautious about it. No slander, no hate, no names. This is just kind of a generic thing. But, you were talking to me earlier about, like, our parents' generation, which is what I'm referring to. That kind of inspired me to discuss this kind of thing. And I'm going to be very lighthearted about this. I'm not going to hate on anyone. I'm not talking about what we were talking about earlier. This is kind of just as a whole thing. Because what was discussed earlier, first of all, I feel like should be very confidential and left alone. But it did get me thinking about the aspect of simply just the idea that previous generations, and the further back you go, it's like beliefs, and I find this interesting more than anything else. Beliefs and understanding of circumstance have a tendency to shift gears. A good example of this, St. Patrick's Day. That's a perfect example of this. St. Patrick's Day originally, when St. Patrick was alive, was celebrated, or not St. Patrick's Day, sorry, St. Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day, not Patrick. My bad. But St. Valentine's Day started with, St. Valentine. I forget his first name. But St. Valentine loved everyone. He would show love and care for everyone. Ever since that, depending on the generation you're in, it's interesting. But the belief on how to celebrate that day shifts gears depending on the generation you ask. Like our generation, for example, Taylor, yours and mine, our generation, for the most part, with some exceptions, historians believe otherwise, but otherwise, our generation has a tendency to look at Valentine's Day and go, okay, this is a day to celebrate the fact, celebrate your loved ones, the ones you love the most. I think you get the point from that one, Taylor. Now, I personally have had a history of disliking Valentine's Day big time. It used to be my least favorite holiday. Nowadays, it's not so much. I appreciate it and I can respect it. If it was celebrated, I go the distance to celebrate with my loved ones. Significant other, family, you name it. I will celebrate it with them, if I can. If I work that day, unfortunately, I'd have to pass, which would suck, but it is what it is. That being said, though, the reason I bring that up is there's a point in time where some generations, not just historians of certain generations, the whole generation, there were certain generations where you ask them, how do you celebrate Valentine's Day? And every single one of them would actually say that they celebrate it by loving all, just exactly like St. Valentine did. And I understand that perfectly, but it's just interesting and yet to me a little bit weird to see people celebrate it in different ways when at its core, it's basically the same way. People shift it based off of their beliefs, which some even judge for it, which is sad, but true nonetheless. It's very interesting, to say the least. Another good example of what I'm referring to is belief on how a relationship should work. Remember, Taylor. This is something Taylor and I were, you and I were talking about. I'm not going to bring up that particular conversation. It's just good prime example. What I'm going to give off is actually just a hypothetical, because that conversation I feel like should just stay between you and I and anybody involved, which actually gets to the point of what I was going to use as an example anyway. People, when it comes to relationships, depending on the generation, it's like the morals completely shift gears. One generation, it's basically the belief that I said, where it should stay completely confidential. The whole relationship should be confidential. But the further back, it feels like, dependent on the generation, they'll either be stupidly open-minded about it and go, do whatever, be whatever, it's up to you, or there'll be some generations where it's like a case of, do this, this, this. Like, for example, let's use Romeo and Juliet, for example. This is a great prime example of what I'm referring to. One corn dog or two? Corn dogs are kind of small. I'd say two. Then again, I've got a belly on me, so a little bit of a dad belly or a beer belly, I'll let you decide. But I'd go with two regardless. Even as a kid, I used to have two of them. But I digress. I guess the idea behind all this is just that, sure, yeah, it's interesting to think about when it comes to relationships, the morals that you go off of. It's weird. Some generations go off of the whole feel like the circumstance of Romeo and Juliet, like I was saying earlier. Like the story of Romeo and Juliet. They get triggered. It gets triggered because of the fact that Romeo and Juliet's parents expected marriage of certain individuals and said, if you even touch that family, you're dead to me. There used to be so many generations that would do that, and there are still some generations scattered that do that, but then the other ones are like, oh yeah, do whatever you want. It's up to you. Well, you can't control love. It's very interesting to me. Let's see. That is true. Dad bod is technically after prick. The reason I said dad belly is just because of the fact that I don't drink. I have in the past, but as a whole, I don't really drink. That's the reason why I said a dad belly, because I do have a belly on me. For my particular stature, it is technically more weight than I'm supposed to have. I'm technically medically overweight by a little bit because of it. Nothing too bad. And as far as the beer belly thing goes, though, the reason I claim that is my character Bob, or Robert. Robert, or, I'm just going to keep calling him Bob. Real name Robert, but nickname Bob. Bob was created while my friend Aaron and I were playing the video game Kingdom Hearts, like the side stuff for it. And there was a joke within that video where we would talk about, like, we were discussing, like, different aspects of the princesses, the Disney princesses that were showcased in that game. I believe they were Alice, maybe Cinderella? Who else? Jasmine was there. I'm trying to remember. Aurora was there. Snow White. And there was one other, but I can't remember who it was. I'm not including Kyrie, the main female protagonist of that game. She was one of the princesses of Heart in Kingdom Hearts, but she wasn't one of the 6 Disney princess references. I don't remember who the last one is, but when we were playing that game, there was a room with 4 of those princesses just standing in there. And our character would like run around. Sora, he'd run around, and I was playing at the time. We were like taking turns playing. I was playing at the time, and I was like, I call that one and that one. I would use that voice too. And this character who was doing this, we were acting like he was like having issues with like he's wanting every girl in some kind of chick magnet who was obsessed or something. That bad stereotype for men, basically, without actual bad aspects to it. I don't know. It's confusing. It's hard to explain. But as the more we used that character, the more we came up with kind of a definitive story, which, by the way, is stored away somewhere on this channel. Hidden in parts. You're going to have to deep hunt to figure it out, though. But I digress. Basically, we came up with this character, called him Bob, and just went off the idea that he drank all the time. Hence the beer belly thing. I'm straight. Raw you too, by the way, just worms. But yeah, I'm straying from the topic here. Basically, in return to what I was saying earlier, I guess when it comes to the aspect of this kind of stuff where it's different generations going off of different ideas when it comes to relationships, I can understand why it happens, and yes, I did just do that. Deal with it. But when it comes to like those aspects, how I am at least, I understand it. I get that people are different, and different generations believe different things based off what they were taught when they were younger, and the peers they hung around when they were younger. But that's what changes it. Different generations have different types of peers, and depending on who those peers are, really shape what the generation itself ends up believing. And like our generation, for example, a lot of our generation believes in the open-mindedness and opportunity to consider any factor, for the most part. Some exceptions. There always are exceptions to what I'm referring to. Like my parents' generation, it was a little bit more stern, and I'm sure anybody around my age has kind of a similar story or a similar experience, if not worse, just depending on where they're from. But this particular generation, that of my parents, those who were born like between the 60s and 80s, basically, anyone born within that time era had a tendency to have a bit more seclusion to their beliefs, just because not as much was discovered, not as much was known, and morals were easier to keep a hold of. Which is why it seems like, and there are a lot of people who vent about this kind of thing. I've heard many, many, many people complain about it from my generation. They complain about this, but a lot of them complain about the fact that, oh, parents are just too strict. They're too stern. Oh, they can't let me do what I want. And yes, that's a very stereotypical trope that dates back to like the 60s. But in our generation's case, it's more realistic for the sole purpose that our previous generation, and no hate towards this, I completely understand why, were way more sternly raised with not as much leniency to go off of as the technological era right now has. And it's a very interesting detail. Like I said, there's no hate towards the last generation. They just didn't have as much opportunity as we do now. It doesn't matter the factor either. It could be religion, politics, jobs, discussive things, society as a whole. You name the topic, I could probably list something where our last generation could be way more restrictive than us because of limitations. But because of those limitations, it's also hard for them to understand what would be going through our head with a wider variety. Now, granted, there are some people within the last generation who have been able to keep up to date on this. What do you have to say about it? My school is starting to protest over the way staff treats students. You know what? That's a fair thing to present on that front. I don't know how you're supposed to fix fall damage. Just worms. No fall damage here. I fall down, nothing happens. I think. Either that or I'm turning into Thanos. Actually, in a way, I wouldn't mind that. Thanos was a powerful titan. Sure, he died via snap. He died of his own freaking creation, but even still, I would not mind the experiences. I think it would be awesome. But as far people are being followed and they're doing nothing about it, that is something that could be discussed as well. We still have about 10 minutes left before I'm going to close out, but like I said, this wasn't going to be as long. You know what? That's another thing. The belief thing, or like the follow-up thing that like previous generation compared to our generation does, that's kind of what I was referring to. If you go to parentals, they hate on it, and a lot of them have a tendency to be overprotective about it. But the less people from that generation you have, the more complicated it gets. And the staff themselves, a lot of them, I guarantee, very few of them are probably from our generation. There are probably a few who are from our generation, but not many. Because of that, the open-mindedness, and this is where our generation downfall comes. The open-mindedness can cause oblivion. Or not oblivion. People to be oblivious. That can cause many of our generation to be very oblivious to reality. And if most of the staff just so happens to be from our generation, that can cause a problem. Or if it's from 2 generations ago that are very similar. 2 generations ago do learn their mistakes after a while. Our generation has yet to learn that. And for the most part. Let's see. The creator of the Brazen Ball. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. When it comes to that kind of thing, it's a morale thing, and it's also dependent on how much of a megalomaniac the alternative is. Like, say, like, to the topic we're talking about, say most of them were of the last generation. Well, in that case, something's going on their end that they're just not saying at all. And they're being very seclusive about it. This is a claim, and it may be wrong. But the reason I make this claim is I met several people from the last generation, and for the most part, a lot of them have a tendency to be very understanding, even with several restrictions. If they're open-minded, there's something either they're hiding, and this is for the most part, it's not always right. There's either something they're hiding or something that they're just getting reflective of. Like a lot of the last generation, if they're not if they're not restrictive and strict, then they have a tendency, or not strict, but stern. Stern's a better word for that. If they're not restrictive and stern, they have a tendency to be that kind of person who holds on to the past and will start suppressing more than helping, benefiting. That could be what's going on. Somehow I figured you were in a high school from that statement. Colleges rarely are that way. High schools are way more, happen to have that way more often. So I kind of figured you were in high school when you said that. It's hard to tell. I mean, I'm 29 years old. The only reason I'm able to tell this kind of thing is because I've taken the time to step back, analyze individuals, the different actions of different generations, which is another thing that brought on this stream in the first place, regardless of how short it has to be, just because, again, I'm very drained. I'm going off of whatever energy I have left. I'm probably just going to do this for like 8 more minutes or something and then end. But the issue with all this is just that those who, from the last generation, not the generation before that, because that one's enough like ours, or your generation, my generation might be slightly different actually, because I think Jakarta, I think your generation is the one after mine, but my parents, your potential grandparents possibly. Either that or they would be your parents and they just had you a bit later than my parents had me. It depends. I digress. That one's most likely the case though. The thing about these generations is dependent on the generation really determines the mindset and how they approach these kind of things, which is unfortunate because a lot of the time nowadays it's tough. It is very, very tough. It's hard to find a good point in time where our generations, or generation, depends, would think on the same lines as the last. It's very hard to have that happen. Get my family, for example. I get along with them great. But there have been arguments, admittedly. Nothing that ended poorly, and they would usually, my parents, when I argued with them, they were usually the ones who were right. Yeah, usually. I'm totally not under-exaggerating that at all. The thing is, though, when these arguments happened, it wasn't whether or not one side was right or wrong. It had to do with the fact that we thought on different lines. And this is something my parents didn't notice at first to me. But give or take about 10 years after this started reoccurringly happening, they started to notice to properly communicate with me, they had to take a different approach. When they started taking this different approach on the matter, that's when I started to myself notice that their generation compared to mine thought completely differently. And were taught and raised in environments that thought completely differently. Which is kind of the point I'm trying to make today, in a way. Which this actually could lead to a proper closing for me. I'm open to any thoughts before ending this overall, because we still got like 5 minutes left. But I feel like that through and through, granted, we all have the same end goal when it comes to these kind of aspects that I'm talking about. But the presentation and the approach are different because of the peers that have been around at the time for them and the ones that are around for us today. Like, I don't know. For example, the peers that I have, I don't hang around a lot of people. Taylor and I were actually hanging out early. Taylor Murray, I don't know if she's still in here. She and I were hanging out earlier today, spending quite a bit of time together. And other than that, it was... Oh, don't... Hi, Michelle, but don't worry, you're not missing very much. This is supposed to be a short stream. These live ones aren't going to be very long. They're going to be like 30 minutes to an hour most, just because they're discussive. So don't worry, you're not missing out on very much. I digress. Another good example are my friends Aaron and Jake. Everyone I just listed, we all think on similar terms to a specific degree. I'm sure some things are different, but not to a very large degree. All of us think along the same lines because all of us were born in the same generation, raised around peers who were like, led us to know of such an open-minded circumstance and how lenient the world nowadays is. Even if that leniency doesn't always lead to good things. AKA places like Florida or California, specifically areas like LA. These are two prime examples of this. But just because of how people are in these areas, they're not all bad, but all in all, from those who I've met who live there say it's not good to be around them a lot of the time. So I get it. But outside of that even with those factors, our generation is way more open-minded, way more lenient. That's just because we know way more. We've figured out and researched and learned way more. Whereas the further back you go, the more restrictive it gets. And are we really to blame for this, or are the people who are taught these things to blame? Not really. Actually, that is true to a fault, Jakar Best, and that's actually kind of what I was referring to. A lot of people in LA, specifically, and this is coming from someone repeating what they've been told by someone who has actually lived there. Egos go off the chart. The problem is, and this is where the leniency comes in, it depends on the person. Sometimes that ego is just a joke, and they're messing around. They're not serious. But unfortunately, sometimes it's not the case, and their minds convince them of it otherwise. It's a subconscious thing, and it's not quite the same. We can go on that aspect for hours on end. But the fact of the matter is just that regardless of... That's a good example, Jakar. Thank you for bringing that up. It brings up a good point. But it just also proves my point of leniency. We have way more leniency in this generation in mind than previous have had. And some may believe they had more depending on what events were going on at the time. For example, at the end of what was it, World War II, I think? That leniency was there, and it was known. Unfortunately, the generation after became extremely stern, extremely strict, and a lot happened. You do some, I'm being very vague, you do some research on that kind of thing, or not just world wars, but anything. Any big event that is extremely impactful. If you have a generation that comes after that big event, that generation has a tendency to be way more strictly raised. And that's what changes that too. There are several factors that can go into this, but the fact of the matter is, where I was getting at originally before I started talking about that aspect, is it their fault? Not really. It's just what they were around. And it's unfortunate, but it is true. With that being said, I'm actually going to leave this here. Thanks for joining me today. It was a very short stream, I know, but do have to head off. Thanks again, guys.
Yeah, it was real.
I'll see y'all later.
Hello.
Bye, guys.
Bye. We just